All right, well, hey, thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. I know you could be many other places, so I appreciate your time investment. I was talking to Sean a little bit this morning. Sounds like you've had a great day yesterday. Sounds like you got even more great stuff today. I'm really excited to talk about Zero Trust, something I'm passionate about. So let's go ahead and get started. A quick disclaimer, though. I could be up here all day, and some of you who know me by watching my videos or talking to me in person, you know I can probably talk your ear off about this stuff. I wish we had all day, we just don't. So we're not gonna go as deep because there is a lot of content, but my ask for you is be inspired by this and go out and do your research and develop your own opinion. Zero trust means different things to different people. Every security vendor out there in the world has a different definition of zero trust. Ignore that, come up with your own definition that works for you and your organization. And it's not about a solution, it's about a core set of principles. And you'll see what I mean here as we go through it. A couple things here real quick. So I am about 3 weeks into a new job at Microsoft. I've been here 10 years. Sean mentioned I was a security architect. I am now in our engineering team focusing on passwordless and zero trust. So you're talking to the right guy. Very excited for that. But I've been at Microsoft for 10 years. I have a lot of stories I'll share as we go through this. And one other thing I just want to mention here is, as part of those stories, something I've learned, not only about zero trust, but just about IT in general. I was in our consulting services division for a long time, going out there and seeing customers like yourself. Everybody's different, but everybody's also kind of the same. And something I noticed, and I'm sure you'd probably agree with me here, IT these days are more about enabling the organization rather than being a blocker, right? Cybersecurity is actually about how do we move the organization forward. You'd probably never thought you'd hear that in the same sentence. Can you be more productive and be more secure? Well, times are starting to change. And so when you think about zero trust, kind of my definition of it is how do we help the business or the organization? How do we help you move forward, right? In the commercial world, it's about raising that stock price and entering new markets. In the government world, it's about public safety. It's about military and defense. It's about helping our country. Whatever your definition, though, is, just remember, how can you help accelerate your own organization towards that digital transformation pie in the sky? I've been in my career for about 20 years now, and going all the way back to day one on my very first job, I grew up in Kansas City, and I was working in a building in downtown Kansas City. It was like a high-rise, it was like on the 20th floor. Anyway, back then, there was really no such thing as work from home. Laptops were still very expensive. So when I came into the office, I was actually in a real office under lock and key. I had to badge in, had to go see the security guard, had to go to my desk, and there was a physical workstation. Couldn't take that home, right? It was a desktop PC, and I log into it, and I'm accessing some kind of application in a data center 20 miles away behind the corporate firewall. And back then, the apps that we had were dummy terminal apps, and so you couldn't really access that remotely. So my point, though, is it was assumed I was supposed to be there, right? I got into the building, I got into the office, I had a badge, I said hello to the security guard, he checked my picture, he checked my photo, he checked my face, it was me. I logged in with my username and password, it was assumed I'm supposed to be there. Times have really changed now, and when you think about, not just with COVID, but just over the last 20 years, we have smartphones now. We have the explosion of software as a service, Box and Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Office 365 and everything else you could think of. And we also have bring your own device. Employees are bringing their own computers and iPads and smartphones and everything else you could think of into the office. USB sticks, sometimes they're not supposed to, but they do. And so times have really changed. And so that traditional model of having that desktop under lock and key accessing data behind the firewall in a corporate data center doesn't really apply anymore. The data's everywhere. The data's going to be stored in Dropbox. It's going to be stored on that USB stick. If you think it's not, it is. I guarantee you your users are going to find ways around it. And so we really want to meet those users where they're at. And so that's really the idea here behind Zero Trust, and really around Microsoft's approach, is we want to meet the user where they're at. We want to secure that data no matter where it is. And we want to be able to help them have access to that data on any device, anytime, anywhere. Securely, and as long as they're meeting compliance standards. So when we look at what's happened over the last year, maybe even almost 2 years now, a lot's happened. Obviously with COVID and the situation with the pandemic, but that's changed IT. People are now working from home or working remotely. Some are going back into the office, myself included. But when you think about where we work, that's changed. So now our mentality of cybersecurity has to change. When you think about the tools that we use, people are using personal devices, right? I remember, back in March of 2020 when the pandemic hit, we started sending everybody home across the country. Some people didn't even have a laptop. There was a customer I was working with at the time, they were a law firm. Nobody had laptops, they all had desktops, very old school. And now they're being sent home to work from home. They had to use like personal iPads and stuff. How do you do that securely and compliantly? That's really hard. But then there's also the risks. Look at the last 12 months and all the cyber attacks that have been out there, right? The SolarWinds attack, the Exchange Hafnium vulnerability. Every time you look at the news, there's a new company or organization out there that gets breached. So things have really changed, and so our mindset around this has to change as well. Cyber attacks 5 years ago were very different than they are today. Our tools have to adapt. Our approach has to adapt. So that's the idea, right? Rather than being in jail under lock and key, where I have to be physically on site or have some kind of a VPN to be able to access that data, we want to be able to provide access anywhere, any device, anytime, securely and compliantly. That's the idea. Okay, let's talk about zero trust. Why are we talking about it? Well, let's face the facts here. IT security is hard. Don't let anybody tell you it's not. And it can also be complex. Even IT itself is complex. So how do we approach that when each user has many devices and they also have data being stored in different locations? The trusted network security strategy, we've been there, tried that, it doesn't work anymore. You can't trust the user's network. Why? Because they're working from the Intercontinental Hotel. They're working from home. They're working at Starbucks. They're working anywhere. And so we have to adapt to that and approach it differently. I talked about BYOD a little bit. Something that scares me even more is SaaS, more so than BYOD. I think you can get a good handle on BYOD. SaaS is even a little bit more difficult because users are going to find ways to get around their data security policies at an organization, right? They're going to go store it in Dropbox. They're going to spin up a personal Google Drive account. So we got to be ready for that. And then from the attacking side, from the attacker side, they're now shifting the way that they initiate attacks. They're shifting to identity-based attacks, right? That's the #1 attack vector is identity. And probably arguably email phishing. And identity is everything, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to join our identity engineering team at Microsoft after all these years out in the field, is identity is kind of the cornerstone to all of it. If I have access to your identity, I own you, and I own your organization. I mean, think about that. If I compromise your identity, I can then get access to data and applications. I can move laterally in the network to go compromise somebody else's identity that's a little bit more high valued, and then eventually get to the crown jewels, whether it's financial data, IP, defense secrets, whatever it may be. It starts with identity. Now, there's a last bullet point here I really want to call out, and that's security teams are overwhelmed. Everywhere in the industry we've been talking about this. If any of you are on InfoSec Twitter, that's a great community on Twitter to follow. But security is hard, but also we don't have enough people in the industry to be able to do this. And so when you think about all of the alerts and speeds and feeds that are flying at you from all your security solutions, you have day jobs too. And so we have to be able to understand that and accept that, and then let technology help us get through that noise and get to the signal. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. Now, again, all these slides will be made available. I gave Sean and team access to this, so if any of you want it, you'll be able to get these slides. But when you think about zero trust, I mentioned enabling the business. So that's first and foremost. And actually, with Microsoft's solutions, we can actually make you more productive and more secure. A lot of that security is built in now. And we've made huge strides in that, and I'll talk more about that here in a second. When you think about user access, though, it's around policy-driven. And that's where we use Azure Active Directory as that central engine to be able to drive that. And I'll show you what that means here in a second. Modern SecOps we'll get into around monitoring and alerting. But now there's another area that we have to focus on, and that's around operational technology. So think about industrial IoT, right? And even in the news over the last maybe year or so, there's been some breaches with industrial IoT, and this is probably the scary part. If those IoT devices are compromised, that can result in a loss of human life and huge financial impact, but loss of human life. That is extremely important, and not just in the commercial space, but also in the government space as well. And then obviously being able to protect assets in a data center, but OT is probably the biggest one. Okay, so what's this all coming down to? Identity. When I showed you that second slide before about how the world has changed and data stored everywhere, what's that common denominator? It's your identity. If I can give the employee or their user a single identity that provides single sign-on to all of those different SaaS apps, well, now I have control over that. So when you go to sign into Dropbox or Google Drive or Office 365, whatever it may be, I can now govern how you access that, right? I can make sure you're coming from a secure and compliant device. Is that laptop up to date on its patches? No, you're not getting in. I could also look at the status of your identity. Has it been compromised? Is it exhibiting any kind of high-risk signals, like impossible travel and other strange behavior? But I can also start looking at where the data is. Wait, that data contains maybe mission-critical information, high business impact information. Maybe I don't want you to have access to that from anywhere but this specific location. So identity allows you to do all of that, and that's why it's so important and kind of core to that zero trust strategy. If you don't secure the identity first, that expensive firewall, those devices, that software that locks down the devices, doesn't matter. Okay, so at Microsoft, when we think about zero trust principles, this is what we think about. Now, disclaimer, these are great, but there's other principles out there as well. I consider you to look at the Open Group and check out their zero trust principles. They have about 8 of them, I believe, 7 or 8. They've got some that go above and beyond this. Come up with your own principles, but zero trust is not a solution you buy. It's a set of principles you apply to the environment. So at Microsoft, our first principle here is verify explicitly. Every single time Matt goes to log into a corporate asset in resource like a file, as an example, or some kind of line of business app, we want to make sure we verify his identity. We want to make sure we look at where he's coming from, the health of the identity, is it compromised or not, does it have strange behavior, but also the device. Where's the device located? Is the device compliant with my policy? Does it have things like encryption enabled, maybe BitLocker or File Vault if it's a Mac? Is it up to date on its patches? What version of operating system? Is that a version that I allow? Is the device free of threats? Does it have any strange behavior? The laundry list goes on, but we want to make sure that device is healthy and compliant. Also, we want to consider what kind of service are they trying to access. I mean, obviously, if I'm trying to access my Christmas cookie recipe on my OneDrive, that probably doesn't have to warrant all of this security. But if I want to go access some kind of a very restricted and important roadmap to the next product, obviously it's going to have a lot more security on it, and so we want to have some more controls around it. And that's where that data classification comes in. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The second principle, though, is around using least privilege access. Back in my consulting days, I went around to, hundreds of customers. What was interesting, now this was a while ago, but what was interesting, a lot of those customers gave regular users admin rights. Local admin rights to their machine. If they were using Office 365, some of those users had global admin rights. Some of those users had domain admin rights, enterprise admin rights, and Active Directory. It's kind of gross, if you ask me. And so using least privilege access has to be part of the strategy. And even if you're an IT admin, you don't need full access. You need to be able to request access when you need it. Maybe I have to reset your password or something, right? Or troubleshoot your machine. I need to request admin access, do the job, but when I get admin access, it's only the access I need. It's not full access. And then it's just in time. It's time-bound. Maybe it expires after an hour, 24 hours, 2 weeks, whatever your policy says. Using least privilege access is a huge part of that. And let's also not forget privilege access workstations, PAWS and SAWS. Right? So if you think about how do you access an IT system, maybe it's a domain controller. Doing that from your regular old corporate laptop might be a bad idea. Why? Because I'm also checking email on it, I'm surfing Facebook, I'm doing other things, it's exposed. I want to do that from a clean source machine. So using least privilege access is a principle. Now there's a lot to unpack there, but it's something to consider when you think about your zero trust strategy, especially for those admins in IT. Now the last one is my favorite one. Assume breach. You know, when you think about this, I want you to think about all the data breach stories in the news and all the incidents over the last few years. If you go all the way back, I think it was 2015, there was a company, they were in the hospitality industry, they had a breach and they discovered that the attacker was in the environment for like 2 or 3 years. It's like me coming to your house, sleeping on your couch, drinking the beverages out of your fridge, and when you and your spouse decide to buy a new home and put down money in escrow, I perk up and I'm ready to strike. That's exactly what happened here. In fact, if you go out and read the data breach reports from Verizon and Microsoft and IBM, there's a statistic out there. Now, it kind of varies depending on who you're reading and what people are saying, but on average, 200 days go by before the attacker is discovered in the network. That is scary. And as we said before, IT security is hard. So we have to have this assume breach mentality. Assume they're already in the network. That changes everything. I mean, think about it. At your own home, assume there's somebody under the bed or in the closet waiting for you. That totally changes everything, right? So when you start to adopt that mindset, it does change everything. It starts to affect how we think about how we secure the environment, how do we do reporting, how do we go tell our executives the progress we're making? How do we help our customers? All of that stuff. So when you think about our zero trust architecture at Microsoft with these principles in mind, this is it. This is the architecture. Now I've got 2 slides here. The first one is just around the categories of things, right? We talked about identity, we talked about devices and endpoints, we talked about the data a little bit in the apps. We haven't really talked about infrastructure and network. We will a little bit, although that's kind of a longer story because there's a lot to consider here. But what's really important is what's in the middle, and that's that policy enforcement. None of these great technologies work unless you and somebody like Summit 7 configured it, designed it properly, monitoring it. The best security products in the world are going to fail unless somebody's behind the wheel. And that's where that policy enforcement all comes together, and then the visibility and analytics behind it. Now, we talked about how how the cybersecurity industry is short on staff. We talked about how all of us are so busy every day doing our day jobs and expecting to monitor the environment. We need automation. And so when you peel back the onion on this, what does this look like from a Microsoft perspective? Well, there's a few things I want to say here. Number one, you'll see some product names. But number two, we also allow with third-party integration. If Azure AD is not your identity provider, that's okay. We can integrate with others. If your CASB is not Microsoft Cloud App Security, that's okay. We can integrate with others. So consider that. We want to meet you where you're at. But when you look at our architecture, this is how we think about it. Now, the most important piece for me personally is what's at the bottom. I talked about automation a little bit, and I talked about monitoring. Again, nothing else matters if you can't monitor it. And then nothing else matters if you can't take action on an alert. And so that's where the monitoring and the automation really have to come in. And in my previous role at Microsoft, I worked with a lot of our partners, managed service providers, and so being able to understand their mean time to remediate and their mean time to resolution and those types of things matter in cybersecurity, obviously. And so you want to be able to apply automation to that, right? I want to be able to automate remediation of those tier 1 alerts. But I also want to be able to provide robust reporting back to my leadership so that they could see the return on investment of what they've purchased. And we could talk more about that later. But on the right side, you'll see apps and infrastructure. Now, obviously, we want to be able to secure the data, and I talked about that before, encrypt it. We can actually encrypt data with Microsoft Information Protection anywhere. It actually travels with the file. So if I take a USB stick, the file I put on it that I give to you is encrypted. If I email everybody in this room a top secret document, it's encrypted. You don't have my identity to access it. I haven't granted you permissions to access it. We'll talk more about that in a minute. With Microsoft Cloud App Security, there's some really cool stuff we can do. Think about that Dropbox scenario or one of these SaaS apps. If I have to use my own personal device to access a file, not a problem. I can log into Dropbox, launch the file, but my policy here will not allow me to download it. I can view it in maybe the web browser, but then my policy also might block cut, copy, and paste, block screenshots. There's some pretty magical stuff here. And then when you think about infrastructure and network, for those line of business apps that you have, it's about network segmentation. Don't have all those apps in the same network. Maybe it's a virtual network in Azure, or maybe it's another cloud provider, or maybe it's on premises, but it's about network segmentation. And then around infrastructure, it's about protecting those servers, protecting those Kubernetes instances, protecting the databases. There's a lot that goes to that as well. In fact, one story I'll share with you, I met an organization, this was probably 3-4 years ago. They had a really high cloud computing bill at one point. And come to find out, it was all cryptocurrency mining running on their servers. Their accounting department, they just came to the IT staff and said, why is our bill so high? Can you call the cloud provider? They called the cloud provider, an investigation went on. At the end of the day, it turned out to be cryptocurrency mining. Now, that probably could have been stopped had they had the right infrastructure security solutions running on those servers. All this comes into play, though. Now, nothing's 100% secure. Nothing is going to make you 100% secure or compliant. It's about defense in depth. And I talked about that assume breach mentality. Well, I think in terms of a tinfoil hat and layers in my tinfoil hat. This is my tinfoil hat. How many layers can we put around my data and my network and my client endpoints, my user accounts, my identities? So if one layer fails, the next layer kicks in. That's how you should be thinking, especially when you think about that assume breach mentality. I mean, think about your house, right? There's somebody hiding under the bed or in the closet. What are the layers you're going to put in place to make sure you detect that individual and get them out of the house, right? Security cameras, home alone booby traps, whatever it may be. Same thing here. Defense in depth is the key word. Okay. Zero trust user access. I'm going to fly through this a little bit because I don't want to go that deep into it. I put this in here for you because I want you to download this later. When you look at how the Microsoft technology works around everything I've been talking about, this is it. And so I would love to go deeper on this, but this would probably take like an hour. But at a high level, Azure Active Directory is in the middle. Conditional access is that policy engine. And it's allowing enforcement of all of these other things. On the left side, you'll see identities in the upper left-hand corner. In the lower left-hand corner, you'll see devices. We'll talk more about devices here in a second. And on the right side, you'll see things about apps and data. Now, I want you to notice, again, if you've got some third-party solutions, that's okay. We want to be able to integrate with that. We want to meet you where you're at. Now, the interesting thing about this is I create one policy in Azure Active Directory in conditional access, and it allows me to enforce all of this. So I'll give you a really easy example. This is a Microsoft corporate laptop issued by Microsoft. When I go to access my email, open Outlook, when I go to access a file on my OneDrive, maybe it's being synced down to my machine, when I go to access that data, it's going to do a series of checks. Boom. What's my identity look like? Is it really Matt Soseman? Where's he logging in from? Oh, he's in San Diego. That's normal because there's a profile built on him. Maybe he's logging in from New York. Okay, that's a red flag. What's the status of his identity risk look like? Has his credentials been up for sale on the dark web, found in public places, that kind of thing? Let's do some identity checks on him. And there's a lot more that's happening underneath the scenes, but also let's look at that device. Again, is it compliant? Does it have a policy on it where, in this case, it's a Windows machine? Is Windows Firewall enabled? Is BitLocker enabled? Is Windows Hello for Business enabled? A number of different things it's going to look for. What version of Windows? Is it a version that we allow in IT? Has it been patched? Is it up to date on the latest patches? All of these things matter. My favorite part is it free of threats? And I think there's an icon here for Defender for Endpoint somewhere. There it is, lower left-hand corner, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. That's built into Windows. Now on a Mac and other devices, there's an agent. But that will actually look to see, is there any strange behavior activity on the machine recently? Think about ransomware. If my machine got hit by ransomware and I went to go open a file that's maybe encrypted, obviously these checks are going to come in. Defender for Endpoint will see, aha, that's been encrypted by ransomware, and it's going to shut down access. And on the right side, we're going to look at the apps and the data that you're trying to access. It all comes together with that conditional access policy. Now, there's tons of videos out there and documentation and white papers on this. I could talk your ear off about it, but I encourage you to go out and do your own research and really understand this because it is very powerful. Again, at the end of the day, if you can't monitor it, though, and you can't get those insights, then that's a different story. So you want to be able to also be able to consume all of this in a way that makes sense for you and the organization. Okay, let's get on. So we have what's called RAMP, and it's a Rapid Modernization Plan for Zero Trust. Again, you can download these slides later, but when you think about how do you get there, Zero Trust is a journey. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you you're going to buy a Zero Trust solution tomorrow and life is good. No way. It's a journey. When you look at the executive order that came out around cybersecurity, and I've been looking a lot at that lately, that's a journey for a lot of agencies. And so it's not a magical thing that's just going to happen one day. So how do you get there on that journey? Well, obviously there's some things you want to start prioritizing, you want to start looking at. And when you start to break this down a little bit, it's also about operations. Whether you're a one-man shop or a large enterprise, how do you think about security operations? And then lastly, being able to consider some of the other things. If you have OT technology in your environment, we have to consider that as part of this approach. If we've got developers, obviously DevOps and security around DevOps is important. But this is our rapid modernization plan for our customers. And so this is available on the website. You can download it later. But it's something to kind of think about. And when you think about in terms of priority, it all comes down to identity. If there's anything else you get out of my talk today, please consider identity as that priority, right? And right here at the top, user accounts. If you're not using multi-factor authentication, you should be. Passwordless, that's probably a little bit more of a journey, right? And I think we can all agree on that. But multi-factor authentication, consider that for all your apps and your data. And being able to understand how do we apply things like conditional access to be able to govern access to those apps and data. That all comes with this modernization plan. Best part about it, it helps you build a plan. Build a plan for your organization. Maybe you might incorporate some of this. Maybe you might go back to your team and brainstorm a few other things that work for your business, but come up with a plan. You could take a picture of this. Of course, you could download it later, write it on the back of your hand, but we've got a lot of resources at Microsoft, obviously, and we've got some really good Zero Trust resources. Now, I threw this in here. We've got a lot more slides to go through, but there are some good resources out there. There's some great white papers we have, technical documentation. My favorite that I put in here are these workshop slides and videos. This is where some of our folks at Microsoft have sat down and interviewed some CISOs out there, talked about their approach to Zero Trust, talked about what's important to them. It's really good stuff that I encourage you to look at. Even Microsoft IT's own Zero Trust journey as well. We're a large enterprise. We've got 200,000 employees. We've got a lot of the same issues that everybody else has. It's been a journey for us. Being here 10 years, a lot's changed, I can tell you that. But it's pretty interesting when you start going through all of these resources. So please take a look at that. Okay, let's jump into this a little bit more. I keep talking about identity. In the world of cloud, which it's going to happen if it hasn't happened already for you, you want to be able to provide that common identity for those cloud apps. It's not about having a separate username and password for on-prem and a separate username and password for cloud. It's not about that. It's about having the same one. It's about synchronizing the on-prem identity to the cloud. Why? So you can do things like Zero Trust. That really busy slide I showed you about conditional access, that's not possible unless that identity is in the cloud. Now, that approach is around a couple different things here. Synchronizing Active Directory on premises with Azure Active Directory. And there's lots of ways to configure that and set that up. But that's really the building block here, is providing that common identity. And not just that common identity, but also that common access medium, single sign-on, which I'll talk more about here in just a second. Do a quick time check. Okay. When we think about synchronizing identity, this is a very high level of what that looks like. But I want you to think about, how do we provision that user account in Active Directory? Does it come from our HR system, SAP or Workday or whatever it may be? There's obviously Microsoft integrations there, but being able to provision and deprovision that identity probably should start with that HR system. And there's other reasons why that I'll talk about here in just a second. Let that interact with either Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. And then from there, we also need to consider any kind of external access. How many of you use Microsoft Teams? Okay, any of you enable guest access? Okay, not many, that's good. It's an important consideration. But if you do, we have to think about how do we provide identity for those guest users, right? That comes into the picture. When you think about once I have my identity, how do I gain access to the apps? It's all around single sign-on. Now, the interesting part about single sign-on and Microsoft's approach is I could go to a portal, myapps.microsoft.com, and log in and get access to all my apps, sure. Or if I'm using something like a Windows 10 and now Windows 11 device, and Hello for Business, when I turn on the computer and I sign in with my face, that's single sign-on to everything. I never ever get prompted and challenged for using a password to go to all my line of business apps. I've already authenticated to the machine. And with the magical integration of Azure Active Directory, it provides that instant single sign-on. But what if one of those apps is not cloud-based? What if it's on-premises? What if it's that legacy line of business app that we have to have? Well, there's some technologies here. Azure AD App Proxy allows you to do that. But there's also some third-party integrations we have. We call this secure hybrid access from Zscaler and Citrix and some others out there that allow you to have access to those on-premises apps from the internet without a VPN. And so that's a consideration as well, but it all comes down to having identity as that foundation with single sign-on. When you think about multi-factor authentication, obviously it's really important. Microsoft did a study, it's been probably almost 2 years now, with our engineering team, where we went through the data and we discovered that 99.9% of identity-based attacks could have been prevented with some sort of MFA. I believe it. When you look at these data breach reports out there, typically the root cause is the user account did not have MFA on it. And so there's obviously different types of MFA. We have the Microsoft Authenticator app, right? It's on my smartphone. I get the push notification. I tap the push notification, approve it. Maybe I have Face ID or Touch ID or whatever on the device, and that allows me to authenticate. Windows Hello I just talked about. If my laptop here is enrolled in Windows Hello, I use facial recognition or a fingerprint or a PIN. That combines with something I have, my face, and something I also have, the TPM chip on the machine with that embedded certificate. That by default is two-factor authentication. Something new in the industry over the last few years is the FIDO2 security key, like a YubiKey. And there's other vendors out there as well where my identity is on the key. Good luck trying to steal that because it's a physical key that's on me, right? And then biometrics, we talked about a little bit with Windows Hello, but there's other solutions out there. But let's not forget about some of the traditional stuff. Now, yes, SMS and voice is a factor, not very secure these days. I was actually a victim a few years ago of SIM swapping and number porting. Now, luckily, it didn't do a whole lot of damage because I caught it really early, but it happens. An attacker actually ported my phone number from Verizon to some other carrier, and they gained access, obviously, to my phone number, and any kind of SMS code that gets generated by an app that I try to access would get sent to the attacker. I caught it pretty early, and I was able to, go through and stop all of that, but it's pretty scary. Voice calls could also be impersonated as well and intercepted. So we might want to just kind of cross that one out. Obviously, there's support for hardware tokens and soft tokens, like a one-time passcode. But think about this with your organization, right? Is everybody in the organization ready for MFA? Maybe, maybe not. Who are the important people, though, that need to be ready for MFA? IT. You have access to all of the keys in the kingdom. You probably need to be the first one to adopt MFA if you haven't already. And then consider your other users out there and what they have access to, and so on and so forth. And then consider the different options. Many options available to fit the needs. Okay. Let's peel back the onion on conditional access a little bit and around zero trust. This is another view and way to look at it. I mentioned, this is a Microsoft corporate laptop, so when I log in, it's doing device checks and identity checks. But let's talk about what's happening on the right side. Through that policy, I have different ways to configure this. So what if you're a contractor? Well, maybe you might be using a device from the contractor's company, and I want to allow you to have access to that line of business app or whatever that piece of data is. How do I do that? Well, there's different methods here, but one of the methods through my policy might be, hey, allow you to have access to SharePoint, but when you have access to it, let's do session control. And let's make sure that we can block downloads of that data. Let's make sure we can block screenshots. Let's make sure we put rails on it. Hey, I'll let you in through the front door of my house and into the kitchen, but I'm going to lock the cookie jar. Many different ways to configure this, and this is where the black box comes in, as I like to think about it. It's almost an endless number of ways to configure these policies. A lot of things are possible, but you need to get started. And the way you get started is coming up with that prioritized plan. What really matters to you in the organization right now? Probably identity, right? Probably the data. Now there's some templated policies out there. Obviously, Summit 7 can help you through some of that. But don't go crazy and start creating hundreds of these things. Create one or two and start to align it to actual business needs. Probably the most common one I see out there is, hey, if the user is signing in and we detect high risk on the user's identity, let's challenge with MFA. Or just block access. If it's high risk, I don't know who you are, I'm just going to block access. That's probably the most common one. Another common one I see quite a bit is if they try to log in from a country other than the US, block access. Now, yes, you could bypass that with VPN and all sorts of other methods, but it's just one layer. So find some of these policies based on your business requirements to create and start to test those. Now, yes, you can apply this to more than just Microsoft. If you've got resources running in AWS, maybe data in S3 bucket, yes, you could apply that. If you've got data running in Google Cloud or Dropbox or any of these other areas, yes, you could do that. If you've got data on premises, yes, you can apply that there as well. So consider that. I talked about single sign-on a little bit. I'm not going to continue on that because we've already talked through that. I do want to show you this slide. So I keep talking about devices, and I keep talking about the importance of this. The battle these days is obviously with identity, but it's also with the device, ransomware and everything that we're seeing there. And so as I go to access those corporate assets, I want to think about how I access it, and that device matters. So there's some of the checks that we can perform on that device to understand, is it compliant with my policy? Is it healthy? Is it secure? Is it free of threats? Now, what's interesting about this is, yes, we support Defender for Endpoint, a native solution, but we also support some third-party solutions as well that can be integrated. And this is what, for me, is kind of the magic and secret sauce. Go back to my device. What if I have ransomware on it? I've got OneDrive installed, the sync client. Well, in a typical environment, that ransomware would encrypt the hard drive, encrypt all my data, including the data in OneDrive. Next time it goes to sync with the cloud, I'm hosed, right? That encrypted data is synced. Well, consider this policy. I create my conditional access policy that performs these checks. It's going to use my mobile threat defense provider, maybe it's Defender for Endpoint or somebody else. It's going to see if there's ransomware on the computer, and it's going to lock me out. It's going to immediately block access to sync with the OneDrive cloud service. So my computer's hosed, right? It's got a drive that's encrypted, but my data in OneDrive or Dropbox or wherever is now safe. That's kind of the power here of conditional access and the zero trust policy, but it's also the power when you consider what's on the device and how to enforce that policy on the device. I'm going to skip over this since we're kind of short on time. I told you I'd get to talking. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is being able to, let me go to the next slide, is being able to look at a mobile device. This is important. Now, traditionally, we think about mobile device management, right? I've got my iPhone or my Android phone, my iPad. I manage the entire device, the entire operating system. I control it. That's important. I can push apps to it. I can do things with it, wipe it. But there's also what's called mobile application management, or you might refer to it as sandboxing. So I can have a personal device, maybe it's a personal Android phone or an iPhone. If you want to get access to corporate email, you install, say, the Outlook app. When you log into the Outlook app, because it's based on identity, it will apply policy. I could do things like apply a passcode to that app. So every single time I open Outlook, I have to type in a passcode. I can encrypt all the data in the app. I can do a selective wipe of just the data in that app. It's a personal device. I don't touch the device. I can only touch the app. There's all these different policies I can enforce inside that app. So when you think about those BYOD scenarios, this is key. Users get the confidence that IT is not touching their device, but if you want to get access to your corporate email, you install the Outlook app as an example. And then now we can provide those controls inside the Outlook app. Now, what's really cool about this is, what if you have personal email in Outlook? You've got Office 365 email and Gmail. Well, again, it's all based on identities. So if you have to have a selective wipe performed, it will actually see your Azure AD identity and wipe all the data related to that identity and leave your Gmail account alone. So when you think about Zero Trust and you think about BYOD, especially those smartphones, this is an approach you can consider. I'm going to kind of skip over this. These are great slides to maybe review on your own. I wish we had more time, but there is one slide here I really want to show you in just a second, and that's this one. Beyond VPN. For many different reasons, VPN is legacy. It's even insecure. If you look at some of the latest breach reports, there was one major breach out there in the industry last year. The root cause of the breach was a stolen password. The attacker got access to the internal network with that password through a VPN. Traditionally, VPNs provide access to the entire network. Now, there's other issues with the VPN as well, but we'll consider that here just for now. So what's the answer to that? Obviously, look at how do you migrate off of VPN. Azure AD App Proxy, it allows me to proxy those line of business apps back through Azure to be able to publish to the internet, so I don't need a VPN. Or I talked about secure hybrid access with some of those partners out there like F5 and Citrix and Zscaler. That does not require VPN. It doesn't give me access to the entire network, it only gives me access to the app. So if it does get compromised, remember defense in depth, the only thing that's compromised at that point is just that app and not the entire network segment that other things might live on. So there's some considerations here, but some things I want you to think about is if you're using VPN today, what do? Do you get rid of it? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing I do want you to think about is how do you integrate that VPN service with Azure Active Directory? Why? So you can do conditional access and do all of the policy enforcement. So again, for example, if I have VPN installed on my laptop here and I go to sign into it, let's do all the identity checks we talked about. Let's do all the devices checks we talked about. Let's apply policy enforcement. That's a key first step to that. And then over time, as we start to look at our line of business apps, are these apps supported by some of those partner solutions or by Azure AD App Proxy? And then maybe that might be a migration strategy. But at the very least, consider that VPN and consider applying modern auth to that VPN. Okay, a couple more minutes here. So what I'm going to do is fast forward a few slides. I put a lot of these in here for you all just so you can go through this at your leisure, but there's one particular slide I want to land on. So give me 1 second here to pull that up. Lots of interesting stuff, but there's one slide I want to land on, which is this. You've probably seen this before. How many of you know Mark Simos or followed him? A couple? Do me a favor, look this guy up on Twitter and LinkedIn. He's a Microsoft employee, Mark Simos. He creates all of these amazing, beautiful diagrams. It used to be we would only have this diagram for the Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture. We now got 50 diagrams that look like this, all thanks to Mark. He's a genius. You can download this and go through it. Each one of these boxes have hyperlinks to learn about it. But when you think about Microsoft security, there's a lot happening here. There's actually over 100 security products. Almost too many to fit on this slide. But what I want you to notice with this, my point, is notice all the boxes and all the lines. Everything is integrated. So when I do those device checks I talked about, or when I talk about doing that session control with the web app, or when I talk about protecting that data no matter where it is and encrypting it, that's all integrated natively with these other services. It's literally a check of a box inside the portal to make that work. And so when you think about this, it's not only easy to deploy, it's also pretty easy to manage because it's natively integrated. Now, what do? Do you go out and deploy all this? No, right? Consider those zero trust principles we talked about. Consider the business and what exactly are you trying to accomplish and do. This whole conference has been around CMMC, so let's consider that for a second. If I want to get to maybe level 3 of CMMC, what are the things I need to do to get there? Might be some of this, it might be some third party, but what does that look like? What's the scenarios I'm trying to solve for? Don't go chasing the carrot here on this. But once you start understanding those scenarios, you can start to understand, well, do I own any of this already? Is there any of this that I maybe already have that we could start to integrate? And then once I start understanding those scenarios a little bit more and what I'm trying to accomplish, what's my roadmap look like for my organization to maybe get there? You know, there's one thing about all of this that I get pretty excited about, and if I were to pick anything on this slide, it's autopilot, which I think is somewhere on the left side. Should be, at least. Autopilot, where I can literally pick up a device from the store, or you could ship me one, I log into it, and it literally auto-provisions. IT never has to touch it, everything gets pushed down, security policy, apps, etc. That's kind of utopia, that's the goal, right? Zero Trust allows me to get there. It's also the scenarios like, oh shoot, I left my laptop at home, but I came to the CS2 conference, how do I access my email? It's about being able to get that work done from anywhere, anytime, on any device. But considering your approach here and the different solutions that are available, and also considering the scenarios as well. Okay, I think we are almost at time. So there's one last slide I'm going to leave you with here, beyond this one, and that would be, going back up, you already saw it before, so we're just going to put it back up here, and that's the Zero Trust resources. Tons and tons of documentation is out there. Of course, any of you are more than welcome to reach out to me. You know, look me up on LinkedIn or Twitter. I might be a little slow to respond, but send me a message if you have any questions about this stuff. But also look at the documentation. We do a really, really good job explaining how this works, how to design for it, how to integrate it, how to approach it. I'm not going to stand up here and try to sell you on any of this. I'm not a sales guy. What I do care about, though, is things like CMMC, things like the executive order, but I also care about your environments. And when you look, again, you look at the data breach reports out there, the root cause of these breaches are always the basic stuff. Passwords, patching, identity compromise, devices weren't secured. If you follow those Zero Trust principles, it's not going to make you 100% secure, but it's going to definitely help you increase that posture and lower that risk significantly. And that's kind of what I want you to think about, is not necessarily the technology, but think about those principles.